Good evening, everyone. My name is Inakshi Sopti, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Asia Society India Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second session of our program series, Safeguarding the Present for a Sustainable Future, very generously supported by the Chatterjee Group Life Sciences Private Limited. Through this four-part series, we aim to convene discussions about sustainable practices in the Indian business sector. These programs will host key individuals and organizations who are leading the way in driving a balanced and sustainable growth agenda, imperative as we reimagine growth strategies in a post-pandemic world. Our program this evening will discuss India's ambitious renewable energy initiatives and the scope for growth within the clean energy space in the country. With corporate giants steadily making plans to enter the renewable energy sector, the green pathscape in India has certainly become a topic of interest for investors and enthusiasts alike. However, regulatory frameworks, interstate power distribution policies, and pricing models, among others, remain critical challenges. With electricity demand likely to triple by 2030, do we have the supply chain in place for clean energy electrification in India? Given how fossil fuels can provide uninterrupted, seamless power supply, are clean energy sources such as wind and solar equipped to match these efficiency standards in providing an on-demand flow of power? Can artificial intelligence and tech act as a catalyst in this transition? We hope to cover all these vital points and more in our discussion today. We have a distinguished panel joining us for the discussion this evening. Gauri Singh is the Deputy Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency. Ms. Singh brings more than 30 years of experience in policy, advocacy, and project implementation within the field of renewable energy and sustainable development from India and the international system. I understand that Gauri has to leave at 7:25, so we'll make sure that we front load all our questions to her. Dr. Praveer Sinha is the CEO and Managing Director of Tata Power Company Limited, India's largest integrated power company. He has nearly 36 years of experience in the power generation and distribution sector in India. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh is a public policy professional advisor, author, columnist, and institution builder. He's the founder CEO since 2010 of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, consistently ranked 8 years running as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions and among the world's 20 best climate think tanks in 2013 and 2016. I'm also delighted to state that Arunabha is an alumnus of Asia Society's Asia 21 Young Leaders program. Harsha Meenawat, our moderator this evening, is Senior Research Specialist for the Energy Program at WRI India, where she works on policy research and analysis for WRI's energy access and clean energy transition work focused on India. A tiny bit of housekeeping before we proceed. All those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. And for our audiences on Facebook, please drop them in the comments section. And with that, Harsha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lakshi, for that kind introduction. And like you rightly said, the topic for today's panel is very, very pertinent. India has set for itself a very ambitious renewable energy target, aiming to install 175 gigawatt of capacity by 2022. And then India went on and enhanced its target to 450 gigawatts of capacity by 2030. Just last month, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy announced that the country achieved its milestone of 100 gigawatt, excluding large hydro, with a further 50 gigawatt under installation and another 27 gigawatt under tendering. So as of now, the country has about 18 months to install and commission the capacity, which is in the pipeline, to meet its target for financial year 2023. For all practical purposes, it is a race against time. But installing these large renewable energy capacity is one thing, and being able to spur our economy, which will be able to absorb the renewable energy created, is another thing. And the electricity sector and its various players, various parts, play a very crucial role in this regard. So to meet, not only to meet our notional targets, but also for the country to transition from its dependence on fossil fuels. But as we move closer to the target, We need the electrons created by these energy systems to reach the customers where they need it and when they need it. And the entities along the value chain, from the generators to the distributors, all of them need to make money from the supply of electrons, while the customers need to be able to afford buying this electricity. So industry trends are actually in favor generally in regard to the latter, which is the affordability aspect, with costs of some select technologies dropping dramatically over the last few years. And that is allowing us to actually take part in this race. But we cannot depend only on those technologies to meet our targets. So if we see on the demand side, our per capita electricity consumption is about 1,200 units, give and take. And it has been growing since the past few years. With improvements in electricity access, this demand is expected to grow further in the coming years. And perhaps a few years from now, when our economic grouping is slated to change to a higher grouping, our electricity consumption might also match with the countries that are more industrialized, that have better standards of living, and hopefully they adhere to higher principles of sustainable development. For now, for us, it is important to understand India's electricity sector and the transition that it is going through, the challenges that are associated with dependence on fossil fuels, and the steep climb ahead of us for scaling up these feasible options for clean energy. And so to weigh in on these issues, we have an eminent panel of experts, whom Inakshi has already introduced. And these experts are here to share their thoughts on either barreling forward in some aspects or perhaps treading with caution in some other aspects. So let me raise a few questions to them. And I encourage audience members to also use the Q&A box to raise your questions to the panel, and we will take them up later during the session. So without further delay, let me pose my first question to Gauri. So Gauri, how do you think we are faring in these green bids? What are the stakes right now for us if we succeed or we fail? And what do you feel and what would you say is India's role in the global transition towards electrification, towards reducing fossil fuel demand and increasing the use of renewable energy sources?
Thanks, Harsha, and thank you so much for having me at the panel. And I'm really delighted to be here with my very, real experts and panelists that I've known for some time. See, let me just front end my answer with putting some global data for you. We've just come out with an analysis recently, which we call the World Energy Transitions Outlook. And we are calling it energy transitions because it's not going to be one energy transition that's going to happen. Every country will have its own specificities and move along this pathway. But one of the key things that's coming out is that electricity is going to be the major carrier for energy moving forward to 2050. And that being said, in India, we already have a very good program that took place in the last decade where each household in the country was actually electrified. So which means we're really at now a cusp where there will be a growth in the demand for electricity, because right now the per capita consumption in India is just about 1,200. And if you compare it with some of the developed countries, it's theirs is in the range of 8,000 to 10,000 units annually. So we do have as we will grow stronger economically, when the aspirations of the country and the citizens increase, then naturally we are looking at a higher per capita consumption. And the question really is, where will these electrons come from? And clearly what's there before us is, we've seen in the last decade that the costs of renewable energy have fallen dramatically. And in India, we've also seen in auctions where the prices per unit that are coming out, the levelized cost of electricity is really amongst the cheapest in the world. So we're in a very competitive market, well placed to move forward for the large targets that have been set. But having said that, I don't think we can just rest on the fact that the prices that are coming in the auctions are less, because there's a lot of work that will have to be done on creating the demand and creating the framework for allowing an absorption of the higher electricity that comes in from renewables. Also, as you can well imagine, governments work in silos till they are forced to work in a coordinated manner. And you can very well have the EV sector, which is being managed by another ministry, go in a different direction, and MNRE, talking about a different framework. So, I'm sure there's lots of coordination that's happening, but it needs to be there and very clearly upfront and there for everyone to understand that the way forward has to be with all the end use sectors all coming under a coordinated policy framework and an approach. And that's how we'll really be able to make it to the very large target. I'll just mention finally that obviously the grid infrastructure also needs to grow, but these things have to all come together. And right now they're there, but I still don't see it coming together as a larger whole, which I hope will happen soon.
Very rightly said, Gauri. So things need to come together, and things need to come together now, probably, for it to actually materialize in the near future. But continuing with some of the points that you mentioned, the thematic that you mentioned, let me move to Dr. Sinha. So, in your opinion, Dr. Sinha, what are some near-term roadblocks, like Gauri also mentioned a few, or some hurdles that then need to be addressed if we are to make the transition to electricity sector powered by renewable sources primarily or majority?
Thank you, Harsha, and thank you to the Asia Society for the opportunity. Let me try to give a perspective to the whole renewable sector and how in future we can meet the access of energy through renewable sources. So first of all, I think there is a huge potential, and in India we are blessed with more than 300 days of sunshine that we can provide huge quantum of solar energy. And then also we have the wind, and hopefully in future we'll have offshore wind apart from the onshore wind that we have. And we definitely are doing some work in other areas. Now, the first thing that is important is that while we have gone for the low-hanging fruit, I would say, of having the utility scale renewables, we've not actually looked very seriously about the opportunity of distributed generation. So there is a great opportunity in India of rooftop solar, even ground-mounted solar, which can cater to the requirement of domestic consumers, to the requirement of commercial and industrial consumer. And this can happen all across the country, and not only in few places, but right where the industry is there, where the commercial activity is there, where the houses is there. So that's one big area that we have not seen large penetration, and of course there are certain regulatory challenges and issues. And if that gets addressed, I think we can see a huge amount of penetration. And the real benefit of the renewable energy of reaching the consumer at the load center will get affected. The second area that we have, and one of the reasons why the utilities are in bad financial condition, is because they need to give supply to the agriculture farmers. And when they do that, there's a cross subsidy or there's a subsidy that is provided by them. And that is a huge financial burden on the state government as well as on the utilities. And again, the penetration is very low. Just to give you an example, we have something like 3 crores pump sets in India. And right now, only 3 lakh pump sets have been solarized. The government program is talking about that it will make it, some numbers are 30 lakhs, some are 50 lakhs, but it is still very, very small compared to the opportunity. We still have 90 lakh pump sets which are running on DG set. So apart from pollution, they also spoil the ground on which these DG sets are there, the spillage of diesel takes place. So that's the second area. The third area is, I strongly believe that in the villages, while the supply has happened and under the government program, every house has been electrified, there is an opportunity to have, again, localized generation through microgrids. And again, whether it is a combination of solar and storage and bio-CNG or biomass, there is definitely a local economy that can develop. And for that, the distributed generation at the village level will help not only reduce the subsidy and the losses of the utilities, but also give the local economy a push. And I think that's the third area. And the last is, of course, that the renewable energy is infirm power. And when you have infirm power, you need certainty. And for certainty, the storage solutions, whether it is electrical storage or mechanical or chemical storage, or we are now talking of hydrogen, some solutions have to come. There has to be more of R&D activities, more of research, and more of financial support that needs to be provided if we need to really come up with very cost-effective solutions for storage. You mentioned, Harsha, something about the consumer side, the demand side. And I think today the technology is available whereby the demand side management of flow of electrons can be much better controlled with the type of automation and the analytics that is there. This is something which is very doable. Since I run a utility, I know that distribution sector, if we do some of the things like on the demand side management or demand response, there is an opportunity, and we have tried it. It's not that it has not been tried. And this is definitely a doable thing, but it requires huge amount of technology intervention, and with many of the things which will happen because of the smart metering and the SCADA and the GIS and some of the other initiatives, I'm sure we will have a scenario maybe in next 2 decades whereby we can say that we will be 100% renewable. So this is something which is definitely doable. This is not a figment of imagination, or it is not a theoretical calculation that has been done. A lot of simulation and studies have been done. And I think the challenges and roadblocks that we have is more on the policy and the regulatory system. If that is supported with some technology interventions on the storage, I think we will have a very, very robust solution to meet our power requirement 24/7. So I'll pause over here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, for that response. I completely agree with you with some of the opportunities and potential that you have identified. But I do want to, frame it in the other way to ask that if fossil fuels are around for at least for a few more years, and like you said, we will take about a little more than a decade to move towards renewable majority energy mix. I'm wondering then, so how do we move away from this dependency? And let me ask that question to Dr. Ghosh. So Dr. Ghosh, if our economy is right now dependent on fossil fuels, it might still be dependent on fossil fuels in the future for for a little while, for the short term. What does this mean then going forward, once we move away from them, for the country's self-sufficiency in sectors like power generation or transport or industrial processes for that matter?
Thank you, Harsha. And first of all, many thanks to the Asia Society India Center for having me. And it is indeed a great honor to be on a panel with industry stalwarts like Dr. Sinha and policy stalwarts like Ms. Singh. Straight to your point, Harsha, about this whole issue of self-sufficiency. Like, first thing we have to recognize is that it's been more than a century since Winston Churchill promised the British Parliament that the UK would become energy independent. No country in history has ever become energy independent, but countries can become energy secure. And if you look at what a range of policy measures and announcements that need to be looked at as a package rather than as independent components, I think we certainly are trying to evolve a new narrative of what that energy self-sufficiency could be. The 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030 is, of course, one part of it. Then there is this 20% ethanol blending in petrol by 2025-26. There's the 15 million tons of compressed biogas capacity by 2024 that is promised. There's the ambition for 30% of sales of new vehicles to be electric by 2030. The entire electrification of the Indian railways, the vehicle scrappage policy, and most recently, of course, the big announcement around the hydrogen engine. Now, of course, we also have to recognize that mere announcements and targets and policies don't automatically translate into action on the ground. And that's where, as the phrase goes, the rubber hits the road. So when I think of self-sufficiency, I would pose the question slightly differently. Do we know that the energy system, or do we realize that the energy system of the future is going to look different from the past? If we have not realized that, let us realize it once and for all. The past is not going to be a predictor of the future. Second, can we identify sectors of the economy that would be called sunrise sectors, new growth sectors that will bring in investment, bring in jobs, and say that those sectors will be not low carbon? And at least I have been racking my brains, unless we are trying to invest in space tourism, which will require a lot of jet fuel, it is very hard to come up with a sunrise sector that is not low carbon. So if we accept these two premises, that on one hand, the energy system will change, on the other hand, the economy of the future will be different, then the question is really not if, but when. And I would say one more question is how fast. And that is where this combination of policy and policy targets, finance, innovation, and of course, behavioral change comes in. And I think at the core, what is missing is that we have not translated or communicated or failed to do so of bringing the energy transition, or to use Gauri's phrase, the energy transitions closer to people. We, as sort of energy analysts, talk in our echo chambers, but in our living rooms, when we are talking to our uncles, aunts, cousins, daughters, mothers, etc., are they realizing the entire transformation that the economy will go through because of these energy transitions? Once we start to realize that, I think a lot of things will begin to fall into place. Let's take this whole issue around storage, right? Yes, energy, and Dr. Sinha knows this better than anyone else, right? Renewable energy is intermittent, is infirm. But are we at a stage of renewable energy penetration that will threaten the grid? Certainly not, right? At the same time, we know that about more than 60% of emerging markets have already peaked fossil fuel in electricity generation. So as India starts rolling this new infrastructure out, we also expect that the costs of batteries and storage or hybrid systems will keep falling. So I think we should not stop the momentum or slow down the momentum simply because an alternative solution doesn't exist. It's like, let's not drive a car in 1911 because there were no airbags in 1911. You evolve the technology as the technology penetrates. A second component that is clearly needed is a complete rethink of how we are thinking about finance. Today, the entire power sector exposure of Indian banks is less than what just renewables will need over the coming decade for investment for that 450 gigawatts. So about $160 billion of power sector exposure of the banks, $200 billion of investment required, right? It's not going to happen by wondering, should we do it, should we not do it? We have to completely change our blended finance policies, de-risking policies, green taxonomy, what we need to attract institutional investment, and so forth. So that then leaves me with one final component, which is the heavy industry side. And we could all argue, and rightly so, how do we decarbonize without deindustrializing? And that's where I think the announcement of the green hydrogen mission and the announcement from private sector of trying to come in with literally tens of billions of dollars into the space is very encouraging. Because we are not going to be able to make steel using a solar panel, but we can make hydrogen using a solar panel. And we can then eventually replace the coal in the blast furnace with the green hydrogen in the shaft furnace. The question again for us is not if, but when. Do we expect to make steel in 2040? Yes. Will the method of making steel in 2040 be different from now? Almost certainly yes. So how long will Indian industry wait before it starts adopting that? Do we expect to sell vehicles or export vehicles to Europe or Sub-Saharan Africa in 2040? Yes. Will we be able to export petrol-driven cars in 2040? Almost certainly no. How long will our automobile sector wait before we start investing in these technologies of the future? It's really now not just a question of the planet, but a question of our economic prosperity and where the economy is headed. Once we internalize that, it's not just energy sector professionals, and then the rest of the economy, the rest of the citizens can fall in line.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Ghosh, for that response. You touched upon a number of points, and I do appreciate you bringing in all of this variety of perspectives, and what specifically what is needed for us is to talk more, not only in our groups, but to bring it out to different kinds of audiences. But you brought about the points of different kinds of technologies, and what then could be explored and then may need to be explored by different sectors themselves. And let me turn to Gauri to ask this question then. What technologies then should the country be looking at now to prepare for the short term, or then for the long term scenario of electrification, looking at the kinds of demands that Arunabha talked about and Dr. Sinha talked about? And so essentially the question is, where should we place our bets in terms of technology, and what are the issues surrounding these discussions?
So Harsha, I think, and I speak also on behalf of IRENA and the analysis that we've done, our sense is that the technologies we need to bet on are already here. So it's not as if you're waiting for some, appearance of some, really different technology in 2030 that will change. It might happen, but, we don't need to wait. So I think the announcement of the National Green Hydrogen Mission is definitely a very, very strong step in the direction that we want to go to. And I was, just having a discussion with the CMD Gale, and he was telling me that, even if now, if I'm asked to blend in 19% of green hydrogen into my gas pipelines, I can do that. Maybe beyond that, I'll have to really change the metallurgy of my gas pipes. But 19%, I mean, that's it's a huge amount that we are talking about with the existing infrastructure. And, I couldn't agree more with Arunabha, who just said that we are sitting at about 10% of renewable energy generation, not the capacity which is deployed, but generation that goes into electricity mix. Right now, we are not really looking at huge upgrades coming into the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure. And, that there is, I think, a resilience that's already there. But it's where we are at present, but what we need to do is to plan ahead, and that's when naturally grid infrastructure will become extremely important, and we'll have to build that resilience. I think the other on green hydrogen, I hope as we wait for the policy to come out, we pretty much lost the race on local content when we had it for solar. And I hope we won't make the same mistake, because electrolyzers are something which are, large forging units, and our EPC can do much better than anywhere in the world. So I think there's a huge chance of getting a whole ecosystem around manufacturing going with it. But the other sector, which I think really needs a policy rethink, is repowering our wind. And when I say that, in all our most, in all the best sites, we actually have wind plants which are, definitely less than 1 megawatt, but mostly in the range of 250 to 500 kilowatt. Now, we're actually, going to be running short of also, the optimal kind of resources for generating wind. So we need a strong policy thrust, which would allow financing and deployment of new wind projects on the existing ones. And that, I think, is a really it's a difficult thing, but I think it's possible to move forward with it. The third area, which I think is also something that I would bet on, is on floating solar, because there are huge reservoirs, and if you can get it right, that's another technology that could really take off very well. And land is, of course, going to become an issue as we move ahead. So, to go back to what Dr. Sinha said, I think we've not even explored the kind of business models that can take off in the demand side management. We've not really had policy frameworks that allow for aggregators that can shift the demand. And to my mind, these are all things that we need to be thinking about and enabling, because if we have a policy framework that allows this, then we can rest assured that we have the entrepreneurial capacity and ability in our people to be able to take that forward.
Sure, yes, definitely. And very rightly pointed out the three technologies, I think, that can form almost, at least definitely in the short term, and even in the long term, we can look at these very easily, I think. Thank you for that, Praveer. But let me move on from generation then and ask Dr. Sinha this, that from the perspective of an integrated power company, do we have the existing grid infrastructure to be able to bridge the gap which already exists between demand and supply? Because we have already heard about what technologies we will be adopting, or we are on the path to adopting. How will we ensure that the electrons flow all to where they are needed?
So I think as far as the grid infrastructure is concerned, let me try to break it into two parts. The first is the large utility scale renewable projects which are being set up in few states because of the natural benefit of setting up in those locations. those grid capability are being added, and I don't think there has been any case where the evacuation has been impacted. It might have been for few months or a few days or weeks, but definitely not something which is a constraint in the long run. And that capability is there, and that enhancement continues to happen as and when the new capacities are added. So the green corridors and others continuously gets added. The second part is in the earlier times I mentioned that how again, if we get into the distributed generation, the requirement of the transmission or the evacuation arrangement may not be so much. If you can do most of these generation at the load center, you will not unnecessarily create large transmission system. And also in the transmission system, you have N-1 as a backup to ensure that there is security and safety of supply. So that also will not be required. So I think there is a paradigm shift that is happening, and that needs to happen at a much faster pace. Is how do we go and do distributed generation and meet the local requirement rather than trying to create it. So we have been used to the conventional generation where coal-based or hydro-based plants, large plants were. So this was what Thomas Alva Edison taught us more than 100 years back. I think we need to move away from that and move to a place where we can transition to distributed generation and distributed usage of energy. So I think as far as the assessment of the grid is there, we will not have any challenge going forward.
Thanks, thanks, Dr. Sinha. And so if we look at then two main, or at least the two loudest consumer categories, or actually that is, I think, also very debatable at this point of time. But Dr. Ghosh, if I may ask you, how would you say that the DRE, the distributed renewable energy generation part, work out for consumer sectors like households or for CNI segment, the commercial and industrial segment? What would you say will be going forward, the challenges there, or perhaps the next steps for that? Dr. Ghosh, were you able to? Yeah.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. I don't know, there was a sudden disruption.
We can now.
Could you? I asked a question when I dropped off.
Yes. So my question was that that Dr. Sinha brought in the need for distributed renewable energy generation as being, one thing that is really needed, and which is, like he rightly pointed out, the paradigm shift in looking at energy systems going forward. I would like to hear your thoughts on how this plays out with the consumer segments and specifically the household segment, or let's say the commercial and industrial segment. How do you think this will play out there?
Indeed, I think just to first of all reiterate what Dr. Sinha was mentioning, at the end of the day, distributed energy is really where the growth will eventually have to come from. We simply will not, if we aim for, say, net zero emissions as an economy, we simply do not have, open land surfaces to build out the kind of energy capacity that will be needed. But we have sufficient, areas, whether on the roofs of our houses or our office buildings or our farms, etc., to deploy there to use distributed energy. Now, what kind of technologies will be needed? Number one, at a household level, as we were just discussing a little while earlier, we now have nearly 100% electrification. Right? What that does is eventually now the demand will rise. So, the whole notion of energy access or electricity access will have to be a dynamic one. It is not just one fan, two bulbs, or two fans and one bulb and a cell phone charging station. That's baseline. And then someone will bring in a television, or then someone will bring in a refrigerator, or then someone will bring in a toaster, whatever it is. So we will need much more smart appliances. The standards and labeling program that India introduced, I think in 2006, if I remember correctly, now will have to be expanded to a lot more appliances that households will start using. Secondly, we'll have to make sure that those appliances are talking to each other. And that's going to be sort of on the demand side, the necessary action that's needed to have that demand side management for the utility companies to then do time of day pricing. Third, beyond the household, you have to look at what are in the area, what might be the other users. So electric vehicle charging, district heating and cooling, cold chain and cold storages. Right? All of this is distributed infrastructure. None of this is centralized. And that means that the distributed energy is now servicing a distributed consumption. The distributed production is servicing distributed consumption. And that's where you need that integration. Of course, on the policy side, then you have to make it easy for the commercial and industrial consumers to be able to openly access this distributed generation. And we know that in many states, that is not yet a feasible option. And that's what holds back the CNI consumers from being able to do so. And equally, as Dr. Sinha was saying, and we've been working with the Tata Power Delhi distribution company here in Delhi on devising these alternative business models where the utility reduces its losses, the consumer starts making more money by feeding that electricity back into the grid. And also when he was talking about the microgrids, there's a case for even urban microgrids to be able to service some of this. The last point I wanted to make is on the rural side. And Dr. Sinha talked a lot about irrigation. I don't want to repeat that. But even off farm, there is a huge opportunity for distributed energy. Our estimation at CW is that farm and non-farm applications of distributed energy for productive users is a $53 billion opportunity in India. Just using solar for using hydroponics to grow fodder for our cattle is a $4 billion market, right? So when we start realizing that, you know, the energy transition is not some tree-hugging agenda at the margin, but a fundamental large transformation of the economy and a huge business and investment opportunity, then we can see how these new technologies, not just the solar panel as we see it, but how hybrid systems, solar plus storage, canal top, rooftop, appliances that are talking to each other, smart meters, Internet of Things, all of this becomes something that it becomes possible. A artificial intelligence where a single wind turbine blade is learning from the next blade about how to predict the wind flow patterns and therefore improving its efficiency. The opportunities and the possibilities are endless.
Very, very rightly said, Dr. Ghosh. I think what you're talking about is actually democratization of energy generation and usage and putting the two together for the benefit of the general economy and local economy specifically. But I do want to ask Gauri this question that, I mean, I did get to know that you might not attend COP26, which is going to happen in about a month from now in Glasgow, but how are these issues actually taken into account in these COP discussions and what goes on there and what should be communicated to those audiences?
So, Harsha, very interesting kind of, I wouldn't say drama, but interesting kind of negotiations and all play out. So at one level, there are negotiations obviously on which are going on Article 6 and things like that. But what really I think I am looking forward to is that you have US coming back to the climate discussions. And it's going to be really interesting to see. There have been some announcements, some recent announcements that US and President Biden has made. But it'll be very interesting to see how when he comes into COP, what are the the ambitions and how they are going to play out, because that's going to be really critical in enhancing this momentum that's already there. I think there's obviously what we've put in our in the India's nationally determined contributions, and that's probably the case with many other countries. It's not reflective of the strategies, the national plans that are actually happening. So there's also a lot of pressure to be able to put in the NDCs what we know is the stated policy of the governments, and that's a big negotiation that happens. I don't think as of now we've put 450 gigawatts, for example, into the NDCs. So it's what happens at the margins is what will be interesting, because any discussions that leaders have, which will lead to large agreements and announcements that can then go into the into a more institutionalized framework. That is what I think is worth watching for. But I would think Arunabha would probably know much more about this.
Thanks, Gauri. And I do understand where you're coming from, and I see that. So the COP is supposed to give us signals and supposed to provide these opportunities and incentives to take discussions forward that align with NDCs. But my question then to Dr. Sinha and Dr. Ghosh, a common question to you both, is, are the current signals that the industry is getting, or the current incentives that are available to industry, are they adequate for India to achieve its renewable energy targets, either the 175 or the 450 gigawatts? And are these signals, which are coming either globally or from within the country, would you say that these are adequate to make the shift from fossil fuels to renewables and to plan investments for the coming decade, let's say? Dr. Sinha.
I think we need to look at it from both central government, federal government, and the state government. Electricity is in the concurrent list, and many things that government of India says, there is huge amount of time which is taken by the state governments and the regulators. So there are multiple players who are involved, and many a times all of them are not on the same page, and that's where we have a whole lot of challenges in enforcing, whether even the RPO obligation enforcement or the open access cross subsidy charge is not getting done in the way that it is envisaged or structured. And I think while the intentions is there, the speed of implementation is very slow. There is huge amount of gap, first of all, between the central government and the state governments, and then huge amount of gap between the Central Regulatory Commission and the State Regulatory Commission. And until and unless there is a sense of urgency and a sense of desire to make fast reforms and fast changes, it will be very difficult to really achieve the targets. Directionally, everyone is there, but the exact numbers meeting will be a huge challenge. Also, some of the changes that the government has been proposing, whether it is in the tariff policy or the Electricity Act amendment, has been getting delayed for huge opposition by many of the states. Now, these are changes which are absolutely necessary and must if we have to reform, because reforms cannot happen in silos. Reforms have to happen right across, and everyone has to be on the same page. So I think the speed is less. Much more can be done. and we are capable of doing it. But I think competing compulsions of state governments, of employee unions, of regulators is not making it happen. And I do hope going forward we are able to overcome these challenges and make this a reality and maybe do much better than this.
Of course.
Again, for the benefit of everyone listening in, assuming not everyone here might be thinking about the energy sector on a daily basis, just want to put something very simply forward to everyone. Between now and 2030, suppose we have to reach the 450 gigawatts target. And as we have already seen, we've crossed 100 gigawatts with large hydro. We are at 147 gigawatts. So we've got about 300 more to go. Maybe some of that will still come from hydro. But broadly, what we're looking at is every single hour of a working day, assuming a 6-day work week, assuming labor is working 10 hours, 10.5 megawatts of renewable energy for the next 9 years continuously up to 2030. So literally the 1 hour that we spend in this conversation, we should have deployed another 10.5 megawatts of renewable energy. That is the pace at which we have to move. And that means it has to be, it's as Gauri ji was saying earlier, it's not about the technology bets. The technologies already exist. It is about now ramping up the finance to get there. Today, we are investing maybe $10 billion a year. We have to invest $30 to $35 billion a year for the next 9 years. Volume that we cannot afford to have any doubt about the direction of policy, any doubt about the sanctity of contract, any doubt that the power will get evacuated, or any doubt that the electricity will be paid for. And these are big political economy challenges. And I think what we've been attempting, over the past decade, this renewable energy revolution that India has had, we've grabbed all the low-hanging fruit. We've demonstrated that India, unlike any other country, can ramp up renewables faster than anyone else has done at a level of development that we are at. But now we have to take some hard decisions. We've got to, as Dr. Sinha was saying, we've got to figure out the Electricity Act reforms and amendments and get it through. We've got to look at how to solve for the financial health of the distribution companies. We've got to look at how to get consumers to pay. So it's not just about reducing costs. It's also about increasing revenue. But over time, you see that net, the power system gains, the consumer gains, there are net new jobs. It's about this transition from the old to the new, which is going to be politically difficult. And there is no way, no beating about that push. Conversation a year from now, and then it won't be 10.5. We'll have to be putting in maybe 12 megawatts because we wouldn't have put in capacity at that pace for the next 1 year. And that means like a cricket run rate requirement, it will keep rising.
Thanks, Dr. Ghosh. That's a very good analogy that you brought forward. And I think with that, I would like to pick up a couple of questions from the audience. And I see that there are 2 questions, one from Andre Brandley and one from Janjri Dasani. And the question is actually, what is our stand on nuclear technology and where does it feature in India's renewable energy trials? And I think before Gauri has to leave, perhaps if she would like to weigh in on this question while I go to the next speakers as well.
So Harsha, I don't think, in the Indian context or in the energy mix, we are looking at nuclear not being a part of it. It's just that, there is a gestation period, which is very long, and it's also a locational issue that needs to be resolved. which often takes longer than it is necessary. So, if those are issues that can be resolved, nuclear is clean energy. But I don't see, I don't think we've really added nuclear power, and that's more because of societal issues and more about the whole perception around its safety concerns. So that's pretty much the reason why it has kind of still stayed on the sidelines. And also, I think the other options of renewable energy have grown so dramatically in terms of reduction of cost, and in terms of also the ramping up of our own ability, whether as IPPs and EPCs, to be able to deliver. That's added to this relative advantage really shifting towards renewable energy, and that's probably the way I think we'll see the energy mix going.
Thanks, Gauri. And I do know that you have to step out now. Thank you so much for your responses and for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
I do have a question now for Dr. Sinha. In terms of, because we have been discussing a lot about distributed renewable energy generation, and the very specific question actually is from an anonymous attendee is, what role do we see wind playing in this whole equation of distributed renewable energy generation?
So distributed energy resources considers everything depending upon the location where you have to do the distributed generation. There are locations in the south of India where there is very good wind speed, or some parts of central India, and those locations would be ideal for having wind and solar and storage. And then there are some locations which are ideal for having biomass or bio CNG. So I think it all depends on the local climatic conditions and weather patterns over there, and what they promote. We are also looking at having some of these microgrids in Leh and Ladakh area, where again a combination of solar and wind is being looked at, along with storage. So I think what one needs to look at is what is the local weather pattern, and if that supports it, why not? It makes immense sense to go for that sort of localized generation.
Great, thank you for that response. Let me move on, and there is a question, Dr. Ghosh, perhaps if you could answer that. In terms of access to clean cooking, which continues to be a challenge for meeting SDG 7. So the question from Sane Naik, and how do we overcome this challenge, and what role does it play, in the overall transitions, at least from the household's perspective?
Harsha, of course, clean cooking is still a sort of unmet or rather unfulfilled aspiration, even though a lot has happened in the last few years. When the Sustainable Development Goals were signed in 2015, India had the unenviable title of having the largest number of people without access to electricity and the largest number of people without access to clean cooking or modern clean cooking sources. Now, of course, in these last 5-6 years, there's been a huge ramp up on the electrification side. On the other hand, we are now upwards of 80% of households having access to or a connection to a LPG cylinder. Most recently, the government has announced the additional 10 million households that will be given a subsidized connection to an LPG cylinder. Now, a connection, as everyone knows, is not sufficient because it depends on the income of the household to be able to pay for the refills. And that is why even the most recent survey that we've done at CW, which is the largest survey of its kind, Indian Residential Energy Survey, finds that we still have a substantial share of our households doing what is called fuel stacking. So you have an LPG cylinder, but you also have a briquettes, and you also have, cow dung cakes. You also have firewood. This, indoor air pollution from unclean cooking sources kills 600,000 people in the country every year. So this has to be a major response mechanism. We did see a fallback on the subsidies given for the LPG cylinders, which resulted also in a drop in the refill rates. It seems that there is some reconsideration happening on that front, on the government policy front, and if the subsidies are introduced and continue to be better targeted for the households that really need it, it's useful. Finally, this links up again to a lot of what Dr. Sinha is saying about distributed energy. Because clean cooking ultimately, can be imagined clean electric cooking. And there are behavioral issues associated with it. There is, of course, you're not going to switch to electric cooking if you don't know if the grid will supply you the power. But if you are guaranteed distributed energy coming into your kitchen that allows you to run an electric cooker, maybe you will switch. So this behavioral shift from the household side is again linked to the business model shift on the generation and distribution side. But if that happens, I think that can be the next big leap for the energy transition, energy access, and the energy transition that India will undergo.
Thanks, Dr. Ghosh. I saw that there were a couple of questions, and they're sort of related, and they relate to trying to talk a little bit more about the environmental impacts of this renewable energy transition. So whether it is mining related impacts for electric vehicles and batteries, or if it is, it's about the waste that is probably going to be created from some renewable energy technologies, and whether we are prepared for the kind of challenges that is going to bring about. So I'd like to ask both Dr. Sinha and Dr. Ghosh if you'd like to weigh in with some thoughts on that.
Dr. Ghosh will respond to this. He is more qualified.
My short answer would be that, of course, we are not prepared yet, but we should be thinking, because see, let's just think about the waste from the solar plants. If a plant is going to last for 25 years, much of our capacity, solar capacity, is about 10 years old, right? We were 20 megawatts 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So the life cycle of those plants is not complete. But that is not a cop-out answer. The real issue here is, of course, to continuously reduce the footprint. Now, India has a critical issue of national security concern around critical minerals. We've estimated at CEW that 44% of our critical minerals demand, which is needed for high-tech, clean energy, advanced materials, etc., 44% of our critical mineral demand can come from recycling e-waste in the country. So what is missing right now, just like the way the solar mission triggered deployment, what is missing right now is a policy direction that kickstarts the circular economy at scale. Of course, you have rag pickers and you have e-waste recyclers, etc. But are we envisioning a circular economy unicorn in India? And once we start doing that, just like we have renewable energy companies listing on NASDAQ or listing on NYSE, one day, maybe 10 years from now, you will have a circular economy unicorn from India listing on NASDAQ or listing on NYSE. But it requires that policy signal to tap into that market potential that already exists.
Great, thanks for that response, Dr. Ghosh. We'll all bet on that circular economy unicorn. So there is a final question, I think, for both our panelists, which has been, I think, posed in the chat as well as in the Q&A, which is, since both of you will be attending COP26, what are you expecting from that meeting going forward? So, Dr. Sinha, your expectations from COP26.
I think apart from the various agreements and documents and the statements that will come out from various countries, what is important is also committing of the resources, and whether it is in terms of the R&D that will be carried out, or it has to be some financial support, because there are a whole lot of countries globally who do not have access or have partial access. They still use the conventional ways of producing energy. And if they have to transition, there is a cost attached to that. And someone has to pay for it. And it's very important that the developed countries and the OECDs and others pitch in and support and do the hand-holding of countries who are not in a position to do the transition on their own. And of course, the second area that I feel that there has to be a huge amount of resource allocation, both in terms of the intellectual resource as well as in terms of money on some of the newer areas. We are still too much dependent on lithium-ion batteries. More chemistries have to come, more storage solutions, more solutions on hydrogen. At today's pace and whatever solutions we have, this will not fly. So we need to have the inflection point at which this becomes sustainable and it can sustain on its own, like today we have solar and wind. So I think it should not just be the talk part of it, but also people have to walk the talk. And that's what I'm looking forward from this COP26.
Thanks, Dr. Sinha. Dr. Ghosh, what are you expecting?
Harsha, I'm largely in agreement with what Dr. Sinha is saying, because neither of us is a negotiator. And then we leave the clauses and the sub-clauses and the sub-paragraphs to the negotiators. But ultimately, what needs to happen? And I say that we need a deal for development. And what does that mean? It means that if you're only looking at the carbon equation, or you're only looking at who is announcing a net zero target, etc., we will keep spinning in circles. What is needed is, what are the building blocks of getting us from here to there, right? And we are not negotiating on the building blocks. We are just negotiating on words, right? So we will need something that provides the large-scale institutional capital. We are not looking for free money. We have one of the world's largest renewable energy markets. We're just waiting for a large institutional investment at a price that we can afford. We don't want to pay 20% interest. We want to pay far lower than that. Now, to bring down that cost of capital, there has to be a provision to de-risk these investments. And that's not just India's problem alone. It's the problem of every emerging economy in the planet. Application of monetary resources and technical resources and laboratory resources and human resources for the next generation of technology. I have proposed a global green hydrogen alliance, because all the R&D on hydrogen is happening in Northern Europe, and all the demand for green hydrogen will come from Asia. And we need a bridge between the two, because there's no point doing a demonstration plant for steel in Sweden when we are the second largest steel producer in the world. If you want to really produce green steel, this is where the pilot needs to happen at scale. So you need that alliance. Third, we need to, as I said right at the outset, bring the energy transition closer to people. Let's remember this.
I think there's some lag.
We are still struggling, not just we. There are more than 100 million people across the world who've gone back into poverty because of the pandemic. How do we revive our rural areas? How do we revive our peri-urban distributed energy? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
That will opportunity in distributed energy. And how can we power livelihoods globally? And finally, against climate shocks. When the pandemic hit, the World Bank's pandemic insurance bonds paid out $132 million to all low-income countries. Wimbledon alone, a tennis tournament, got $141 million from its pandemic insurance. This is the inequity we have in the world. And the pandemic will be a small blip compared to what the climate crisis will unfold and impose on all of us, on our vulnerable communities. There is no insurance cushion. So I would hope that serious conversation and action on finance, on technology, on next generation technology, on bringing the energy transition closer to people, and on creating an insurance cushion for the vulnerable communities is at least what the negotiators can aspire for. Otherwise, we will be talking about square brackets and nothing more.
Yes, complete agreement with you, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you very much for that response. We are nearing the end of time, and so I think it's time that we conclude. But I really want to show my appreciation for the thoughts that have been shared on this panel, and some of them were very important, because we do realize that electricity is going to be, like Gauri said, the major carrier for energy going forward. And if we have to get through this transition, we have to work together. But we already do realize that there are some sectors, there are some energy technologies that we should be banking upon. One of them, which I think was discussed quite a few times, was the distributed renewable energy generation models, which definitely need a lot more trust behind them. And there are obviously other technologies as well, with green hydrogen being one where we have already stepped in to take it forward. And like Gauri identified, repowering wind is something that we should be definitely discussing and taking forward. But the important point is that while we are moving towards this low carbon type development, what we need is behavior shift, and what we need is what business models should be then changed so that this behavior shift can be incentivized. And that, I think, is the takeaway from here, that it's not just going to be about technology. It's definitely going to be a lot more about the other issues that relate to the energy sector and the other issues that relate to electrification that are going to weigh in upon this sector and that are going to eventually decide how we move forward and how we succeed and how we fare in this space. Thank you very much.